When I first suggested this talk, my motivation was the same, especially this topic. While preparing the speech, something has changed. Therefore, my first pioneer talk was quite different from the finalized version. In fact, I was thinking that the audience will be mostly composing of young people, but I think they're spending their time outside anyway. Why I chose this topic, what AI wants from us. Now, for the last 3 decades, in psychiatry, many developments occurred, and when we look at these developments, when we think of these 30 years, some of the developments are considered as we solved some of the problems or we took another steps. 5 years later, some of the existing problems will be solved, and there is somehow promising developments, and from the medication sector and from different sectors. For example, the European Union spent 600 million euros to recreate the human brain in a computer in terms of its functional principles, and from the PI, the top PI said that we were going to do it within 10 years. With the help of softwares, a virtual brain could be created according to them. And at this point, yes, there are many studies published, but we are not even close to the target. A second problem, especially for people like me who work for some institutions that provide you some fund to do research, and I'm among the assessors in those institutions. There are some problems you encounter in every project that you see. People are talking about AI, and they're trying to discover and explore the methods, but this is a process which starts with a more logical regression analysis. But every researcher is sometimes adding AI to their project, but they think that the uh, reviewers will be affected by this because however, in every panel of us, there is also an AI export. The inputs, outputs, cost functions are all taken into consideration, but these are lacking in the projects. So these projects cannot be carried out for some reason. AI is not a system that does everything on its own. You need to manage it in a rational way. Therefore, there are two important bases for these AI projects. On one side, there is a promise, and there are some surprises, and on the other side, these become like a Hollywood movie. The project developers only focus on the targets, but they think that their targets will be achieved, but this is not the case all the time. Mio Chang published this study last 1 or 2 years ago. It was on molecular psychiatry, and for many of us, publishing some article in molecular psychiatry is very significant. And during those times, frontal posterior functional imbalance was their idea, and they tested this idea via deep learning, and it was published. It was a good study, and the topic was published in molecular psychiatry, and they claimed that there is an imbalance in major psychiatric disorders, and this can be balanced through deep learning, and there's no problem. Automatically, this study was appreciated by many, but Nis Winter and Tim Han wrote a letter to the board, and especially the deficient parts regarding the cluster and non-stabilization were reported to the journal. On one hand, Mia Chang is lucky because somebody corrects their study, but on the other hand, the actual problem is that the details of the toolbox that they used are not known. Therefore, the deficient parts couldn't be seen by Niels and his team. And last year at Enigma meeting in Antalya, presented their speech, and the deficient parts were conveyed at their speech. While using these toolbox, the details are ignored or missed. I do not know. I'm not claiming that I know every detail. However, there should be a multidisciplinary approach with the experts. Of course, the same team must have a leader. Çağdaş, here you can see Çağdaş. He must collect the team, and including Nis and Tim, you see that they're all lying on the beach, and these people are very have progressed in artificial intelligence. So why we should be skeptical in these works? When we look at the history of AI, for twice throughout the history, the targets couldn't be achieved, and there were deviations. You know some of these. One was towards the end of 1960s, and the other was in 1980. Support vector machine entered into the life, and the problem was solved. The problem tracing back to 1980s was solved, and the other problem was solved through exposed systems. However, the actual problem here is that if you use the AI rationally and in a correct manner, you can progress in many fields as expected, but or else the system will make you return to the very beginning. Through machine learning, what do we learn? There have been many sessions held. This is the study conducted by Farugambilla et al. Through pharmacotherapy. A prediction could be achieved using machine learning. It was a very good study, very well elaborated. There was the article was good, but in the end, you learn nothing new, because as a clinician, you know that long use of antipsychotics and healing are related. Comorbidity affects the treatment, or elevate exacerbations, or the pathology in the frontal region also helps the treatment. If the conductivity in the frontal lobe is not good, you cannot measure it. The problem here is that there are at least 30 studies here. Even though those 30 studies are summed up, in the end, there is nothing new provided by machine learning. What's the actual problem here? Is not trying to achieve something through machine learning. Using AI or machine learning is problematic here, because when we say artificial intelligence, it is simply not a rational system. It perceives its environment, and its independent is in this. The system is supporting you, just like I and Çağdaş. We are working together, we are seeing the same patient, but our perceptions may differ. Exactly like this, artificial intelligence will provide you this difference. Therefore, together with AI, there may be some points you have realized and you have not realized, but independent on you, artificial intelligence must be able to retrieve the data. If it cannot do this, then there will be of no use, because if you already input the known data, this will be just statistics for prediction, not new. And machine learning is also providing you some conclusions with the same input or different inputs. Therefore, the basic target here must at least be that while using artificial intelligence in the researches, not finding something new together with the artificial intelligence, it must broaden our perspective and it must guide us. And the system must serve us in that sense, and algorithms may be developed in that sense. Um, Of course, the data that you input in deep learning, all the features will not be learned by deep learning. There will be many nodes filled in, and it will be useless because you need to tell the deep learning what you are searching for. Supervised learning is when we want the machine to learn the themes that we identified earlier. Unsupervised learning is just clustering, and there will be a dimensionality reduction. And reinforcement learning is also maximization of the rewards. We learned this in computation psychology, but I will not go into details there. During my residence, one of the most significant problems in 1994 was the diagnosis, clinical diagnosis. We could diagnose depression and manic was already clear, but schizophrenia was always in my mind because my professor was saying schizophrenia to a patient, but then he was saying bipolar. And some patients was coming, he had hallucinations, not forming sentences. The other patient was not speaking, seems to be depressive, but not depressive. And two were both diagnosed as schizophrenia. And I said that I will go to Bakırköy to learn it better with Shah Persoy. And my professor said that there's an diagnosis tree in DMS and ask questions, and if your answer, depending on your answers, your diagnosis will be possible. So it was an easy way to diagnose, but that was not the problem. Our basic problem is while learning something or while learning we are referring to something, our brain is learning something over references. Therefore, Aristotle also said the same. Aristotle says that excellence, a perfect man, a perfect male, he was only referring to the males because women were not taken into consideration in those times. There were classifications for human beings, they were staging for the males. But if you look from the perspective of Darwin, there were classifications. And when we look at the brains of the schizophrenia patients, they were quite similar. Therefore, the distribution of the brain of schizophrenia patients are much broader than the normal brain, and their brain are not similar, and that similarity is quite different from the normal life. Therefore, at the basis, there are variations within this disease. In those times, one of my heroes was Tim Crow, because in there was a simple classification, and he identified type 1 and type 2 schizophrenia. In type 1, there were delusions, hallucinations, and the type 1 patients were responding to the treatment well. And it was quite logical for me because I could see it clearly. On the other hand, more negative symptoms. Patients were responding worse to the treatment. Therefore, that course was more negative, as claimed by him. And in time, there were more distraction among type 2 patients. and it was also met my expectations and need in those times. I do not make it for clear for the references of that time, but I was saying that I could diagnose. But Terry Holberg and Daniel Warnberger adopted a total different approach, and they said that all the problem was related to the severity of the disease. The more severe the disease is, the more severe symptoms were seen and the response was worse. Therefore, the disease severity and symptom severity could be measured and that problem could be eliminated, as they claimed. For them, there may be many etiologies, however, phenocopies may represent the expression of a unitary pathogenesis of greater or lesser impacts. That was quite significant because, of course, at the beginning of every article, there are some clinical symptoms mentioned. However, if the disease is itself heterogeneous and had different pathogenesis, it requires a different treatment. In those times, William Carpenter defined deficit and non-deficit. This was quite beneficial. The primary negative symptoms were seen among 15 to 20% of the patients, and negative symptoms were seen among 60% of the schizophrenia patients, and their brains were examined, and enigma was seen in both schizophrenia groups. It was decreasing in both groups, but the blue parts, especially the mediocortical and precuneus areas, it was much less decreasing among the deficit patients. On the other hand, paracentral and frontal whole was more reducing among the non-deficient patients. So when a subtyping is done, we can say that deficit schizophrenia with more negative symptoms are seen, but this is independent on the antipsychotic medication or the environment, and these patients must be followed up for at least 10 years. And that was a good subtyping for me because clinical symptoms were well explained with this. Indeed, when we follow up the patients for 5 years, ventricular non-deficit was stable among non-deficits, and but when we look at the deficits, ventricles were broader in these patients, as also indicated in this study conducted by Hapdurgun et al. And also positive and negative continuum was also examined by I put this photo centrism with Clinton especially. At least we see that scientists are also appreciated by the politicians on some occasions. But still, do we need a subtyping? And of course, because many of the patients cannot be treated regularly, there may be different pathogenesis, or if we adopt a different approach, we may take steps oriented for our target. It's possible to conduct two types of researches: classical research. In that one, we have a hypothesis, and of course, through some assumptions, you define your hypothesis, then you test your hypothesis, you collect data, analyze them, and you look at the results and refine your hypothesis, collect data again, and it goes on like this. This is the standard one, and generally, one of the most important mistakes done is that they come without these steps. They come with an idea, and then, unfortunately, we face some fatigue during this process. In the other type of research, you can test multiple hypotheses without deficit, non-deficit, or other subtypes. You just put forward your data, you try to retrieve data, and you try to develop your hypothesis basing on that data. And this is the most ideal approach for machine learning. If you have data big enough for this, on your behalf, machine learning can accompany you in this process. For schizophrenia, is it tried? Yes. The first study I will mention is conducted by Carol Hamilton, and it's a SNP study, B-SNP study, where data is collected from 6 different centers, and the schizophrenia cohort is less than 600, and their families, and there is also a control group. And they were looking for intermediate phenotypes, and despite their budget, they couldn't find any intermediate phenotype, but they found some cognitive functions, circadian eye movements, and electrophysiologic stimuli like A100, P100, etc. They put all these in a clustering system. They are inputting these not one by one, but they form some constructs close from the data closer to each other, and they form 2 domains. On the right hand side, you can see the 3 subgroups, and they had the chance to identify these 3 subgroups. Type 1 or biotype 1 was electrophysiologically low amplitude and latency patients, and biotype 2 was, on the contrary, they were hyperactive groups in terms of sensory movements, and the third group was quite similar to the control group. These are psychotic or schizophrenia patients. When you look at their cognitive control, this is the control group, and this is a biotype 3, and they are quite similar to controls. And these are psychotic patients. And when you look at their sensory motor movements, actions, this is also similar. But in biotype 1, there is a serious cognitive dysfunction, and in sensory motor, there is inadequacy. But in biotype 2, there is a serious high level of sensory motor reactivity. Interesting point here is that bipolar schizophrenia and psychotic groups, when you compare them, although in biotype 1 schizophrenia is higher and bipolar is less, in type 3 there is also schizophrenia and a few bipolar. However, for biotype 2, there are people from the 3 groups, which shows us that, yes, phenotypically we can discriminate schizophrenia from bipolar and psychotic, but their brains are quite different, because in K-means, that was not a good classification system in those years, but in K-means classification, they could be discriminated. And here, the score was also measured, and in biotype 1 and 2, this level was higher compared to the other group. What about their gray matter? There was no discrimination that was based on gray matter. In B1, there is a important reduction in gray matter. In B2, it's less, but in B3, gray matter reduction was less compared to the other 2 groups. When we look at their first degree relatives, in B1, there is slightly more gray matter reduction, and in B2 and B3 that was less. So basing on a biological data and using a data driven construct, we were using multiple parallel parameters. There was a subtyping, but this subtyping must be validated because there is something overfit, because the same data is used and they may overlap. And Chinese people, scientists, came into the scene here. They also added some factor here. They try to minimize the parameters here, and as a mid course, they added people who lived with the disease for some time. Therefore, antipsychotic and cause of the disease was minimized, and they tried to see whether they would achieve the same results. And in their approach, they used a different clustering system. In the previous clustering system, the diameter of the circle was taken into consideration while forming that density. However, that circle was not required here, and the density was evaluated differently. So they looked whether that group was distant from the other group, and the data of the Chinese and the U.S. were compared and overlapped, and they saw that only 5 patients changed their group in the clusters. Therefore, only considering the brain imaging techniques, we see that subtyping was valid. And in the first episode, gray matter loss was less, especially in rostrantery cingulates. There was more gray matter in biotype 1. In the mid course, for more than 10 years, the loss was higher. In biotype 2, the only difference was seen in hippocampus. For biotype 3, schizophrenia patients and controls were compared, and there was nearly no difference in the brains. Therefore, we are sometimes conducting studies, and there were some applications. An applicant was from Kocaeli, and he took some images from the brains, but there was no difference. Therefore, most probably, he took biotype 3 patients. So the problem here is that the gray matter loss it can be scored, and you can compare the patients depending on that loss. In this group, there is no difference in the gray matter loss compared to the controls in the first episode or in the long term. Therefore, rather than a phenomenological classification, a data driver classification is prominent. Kiral Temenga likes hippocampus. Everything starts from hippocampus, according to him. The data verifies this. In schizophrenia, gray matter loss is seen more, but when schizophrenia is compared to when we compare schizophrenia with schizoaffective, it is not different, but when they compare it with bipolar, it's clearly seen. It's one of the studies, phenom study, psychosis heterogeneity evaluated via dimensional neuroimaging. The cause is the AI expert here, and they had adopted a different systems. Hydra called system was used. I know it from Avengers. There was also Hydra monster-like thing. And what was the advantage here in k-means and in deep cluster formation? In those models, control groups were not taken into consideration in detail. However, in this study, the control group were selected very diligently, and the confounding variations were also considered. And when you do it like this, you have two subtypes in schizophrenia. The one is the one you see on the left-hand side, gray matter loss is high here, but on the other hand, you see that pitumen and in basal ganglia, the gray matter increases in this group, and this is independent on the medication use. This is quite significant because regarding psychosis, you may remember that pitumen is related to the transdiagnosis relation. But what about the symptom severity? There is no difference. In group 1, the education level is worse, but the severity of symptoms are quite similar. Antipsychotic use is almost the same. There is no statistical significance. However, is it deficit syndrome for group 1? Actually, Tim Chrome's type 1 and 2 is my favorite, but this is not a deficit syndrome because the population of deficit is maximum 15 to 20%, but here gray matter increase is seen among 60% of the population. Therefore, this is quite a new biotyping as we see. And in this biotyping, the gray matter is decreasing in type 1, but in type 2 it doesn't decrease. Therefore, yes, the symptoms are common, but pathophysiology is not the same. To sum up, in type 1, there is a broader volumetric disease, the educational level is lower, the gray matter volume is decreasing, but the symptoms are the same with type 2. Until now, I tried to convey the message to you clearly that when you go a phenomenological subtyping, gray matter doesn't matter. But when you take AI to accompany you, you will get different results. In Enigma study, the most important advantage was that the patient cohort was higher. That study involved 7,000 people, 5,000 participated in the analysis. Some part of the codes were developed at our lab. Asia and Europe were compared to two. We are in the middle, therefore, we were added to the US part of the study. And the finding here is that it's quite interesting because there are thousands of patients, and it was possible to look at the trajectory. When you look at the trajectory, in trajectory 1, starting from the Broca area, there is a gray matter reduction and it progresses by aging. But in trajectory 2, you see that it starts from hippocampus and it progresses. So, whatever cross section you take, there will be changes in different parts. If you take T8, there will not be so much difference, but if you take T3, the two schizophrenia groups will be different from each other. Therefore, the machine learning program is sustained here. The sustain catches this. When the time parameter is used, the pathophysiology in schizophrenia is different in two groups, although the symptoms are similar. And again, there is no difference when you look at the symptoms as a total, but different pathophysiologies could be seen. First episode schizophrenia, trajectory is not followed up that much, or non-medication patients are not followed up for that long in the subgroups. But when the Asian and European populations are separated from each other, we see no difference between these two. It is independent on ethnicity, and the trajectory starts with a broadening in Broca area. It starts from the hippocampus, continues to the basal ganglia, and in the cortical zone. And when you look at the long term, when you divide the groups into three, in trajectory 1, more positive symptoms are seen. Depression and anxiety symptoms are higher, and it causes more pathophysiology. It's clear from the cortical degeneration. However, it's almost impossible to differentiate these two among the two groups.
Bu yapılmadı.
This study hasn't been implemented yet, but regarding other algorithms, considering inputs are vectors, other vectoral parameters can be used. Resting steam fMRI is another one. It has more data points, more drawable, and time is also included as a parameter here. And from this graphic, you can see clearly, well, the pointer is not working right now. I am trying to return. When you take a look at the dimensions of the matrices, the number of features is declining to 54. Among these features, matrix is developed and then average is taken. Then, as you know, deep learning nodes are transferred. Well, when you take a look at the resting state data, especially among schizophrenia patients, paracentral area and supplementary motor area are active. They play an important role, contribute to the classification task. On the other hand, especially in the schizoaffective disorder, hippocampus accompany the process. One of the most important findings that I want to share with you is this. Schizoaffective disorder has two clusters here in this example. So what's the difference between these two clusters? More emotional withdrawal and the thought of shame and accusation, guilt feelings, tension, according to this graphic. B synapse is the owner of this data, resting state data. Bottom line, it's not very easy to work on the resting state because the amount of data is very high and it's not possible, it's not very easy to work on it. But as you can see, we can obtain 3 clusters. In conclusion, non-clinical objective inputs like fMRI shows that schizophrenia might have multiple subtypes. At least it seems to be feasible. Instead of parameters, making use of constructs including several different parameters might be better than single measurement or marker. Again, the sites where the MRI imaging is taken should be considered. I showed you some serious study findings. As you saw, especially over the hippocampus area, there was a decline in the cortex area, and such findings unfortunately cannot be directly replicated nowadays. Thus, such findings cannot be put into practice in our clinics. In addition to this, AI technology right now is on top of the methods that we make use of, but still we don't have enough data set. We are trying to increase the number of activities where we make use of AI. AI also asks for specific data. Therefore, we require singularity, which means collaboration of humans and AI. At least, in my opinion, right now the population in the world is about 10 billion. So it won't be very useful to be replaced by the AI. With these words, I'd like to thank you all for your patience.